What kind of war forces a soldier to choose between dying for his country and being killed by his own commander? That question is not theoretical. It happened. It is documented. And the answer to it exposes something about the Russian military that no frontline map, no official statement, and no casualty number has been able to show us, until now. 3 Russian soldiers made a decision. They looked at the order in front of them. They looked at what had happened to the men who followed that same order 2 days before, and they said no, they refused. Not out of cowardice, not because they never intended to fight. They refused because they had watched an operation fail twice already, and they were being asked to repeat it under conditions that were worse than the 2 times it failed. Their commanding officer did not send them to a military tribunal. He did not file a disciplinary report and wait for a response. He ordered their execution. And 3 soldiers who had refused to walk into Ukrainian fire were shot dead by the institution that had recruited them, trained them, and sent them to war. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, unflinching analysis is what you come here for, now is the time to make sure you never miss another one. Hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like if this is already making you think. And if you know someone who needs to understand what is really happening in this war, share this video with them today. Because what we are about to get into goes much deeper than this one incident. The unit these 3 men belonged to was not a collection of hastily conscripted volunteers with 2 weeks of training. They were part of the 247th Guards Air Assault Regiment. That name carries weight in the Russian military. The airborne forces, known as the VDV, are the most prestigious component of the entire Russian military structure. These are soldiers who were selected for their ability, men who went through demanding training because they wanted to belong to something elite. The VDV identity is built on one idea: we go where others cannot. So when soldiers from a unit like this refuse to advance, you need to understand what that actually means. This is not hesitation from men who were always looking for an excuse to stay back. This is men who believed in the mission, believed in the institution, and at some point, after watching enough of what this war actually produces, stopped believing that the institution still deserved their lives. That gap between what the 247th promised its soldiers and what the 247th became inside this conflict is the gap that explains everything that followed. Here is what the specific situation looked like. The assault was ordered against a Ukrainian defensive position in the northern Zaporizhzhia sector. Russian command had determined this position needed to be cleared to improve the tactical picture in that part of the front. It sounds clean when described that way. It was not clean. That same position had already been hit twice. Both previous assaults had failed. The second one had suffered casualty rates around 40%. To put that in plain language, nearly half the soldiers sent on that mission did not come back in fighting condition. A 40% casualty rate is not a setback. It is a military disaster. Any serious military institution that experiences that outcome does not simply order another assault on the same position under similar conditions. It reassesses, regroups, and asks why the previous approaches failed before sending more soldiers to the same fate. That reassessment did not happen here. What happened instead was a promise. The soldiers of the 247th were told that the third assault would have fire support that the first 2 did not. Artillery coverage. The kind of suppression that would make the difference between a suicidal charge and a viable military operation. The fire support never came. It was not a miscommunication, it was not bad timing. The artillery unit responsible for delivering that support had its own ammunition allocation problems, the same ammunition shortages that have been a recurring feature of Russian logistics throughout this conflict. When the assault was ordered, the promised coverage was not there. The defensive position was just as capable of destroying another assault as it had been twice before. And that is when the 3 soldiers said no. Think carefully about what it took to make that decision. These men had already accepted enormous risk by joining the VDV. They had already watched comrades go forward and not return from earlier operations. They were not new to this. The refusal was not panic. It was a cold, rational assessment. We have watched this fail twice. The support we were promised is not here, and the situation in front of us is worse than the situation that destroyed the soldiers before us. By any reasonable military logic, their refusal was sound. They were not wrong about the tactical picture. Their commander's response tells you everything about the pressure inside that institution in that moment. He did not pause. He did not negotiate. He did not use the established military justice system that exists precisely for situations like this. Situations where soldiers contest orders, where discipline problems arise, where institutional tools are supposed to handle the friction between command authority and individual judgment. He immediately ordered their deaths. There is a concept in military thinking sometimes called force of example. The logic behind it is straightforward. Make a visible example of the men who refuse, and the remaining soldiers will conclude that following orders is safer than refusing them. It can work, but it only works under a specific condition. The soldiers who witness the punishment have to believe that the institution making the example is fundamentally legitimate, that the executed men were aberrations, that the order itself was reasonable, and that the institution asking for compliance has the right to demand it. Force of example does not work when the soldiers watching the execution share the same calculation as the men who were shot. When they look at the 3 executed soldiers and think not that those men were wrong, but that those men were simply the ones who refused first. That is the situation the soldiers of the 247th found themselves in after the executions. They advanced, not because they were persuaded the assault was worth their lives, not because the fire support had arrived, or because the Ukrainian position had suddenly become more vulnerable, or because the plan had changed in any way that made the 3rd attempt more viable than the first 2. They advanced because the immediate threat of execution by their own commander competed with the threat of Ukrainian fire. And in that moment, moving forward felt fractionally less certain to kill them than standing still. That is not discipline, that is coercion. And there is a real and critical difference between those two things. Discipline is what makes military institutions capable of extraordinary things. It is voluntary in the deepest sense. Soldiers follow orders because they trust the institution, believe in the mission, and accept that their judgment must sometimes yield to a larger operational picture they cannot fully see. Discipline creates soldiers who adapt, who take initiative, who push through uncertainty because they believe the institution behind them is worth that sacrifice. Coercion produces something that looks like compliance but functions completely differently in practice. Soldiers who advance because there is a gun behind them do not advance the way soldiers do who are committed to the mission. They do not show initiative. They do not adapt when the plan encounters reality. They do not take the risks that effective assaults require because the calculation driving their movement is survival, not success. They move because they have no other choice. And when soldiers move only because they have no other choice, the results follow. The 3rd assault on that Ukrainian position ended the way the 3 soldiers who refused predicted it would. The men who were compelled to advance by the threat of execution did not take the objective. Ukrainian military reporting from that period describes the assault as catastrophic in terms of casualties. The outcome was the same as the 2 failures before it, except now 3 soldiers were also dead at the hands of their own commander. The advance that the executions compelled produced exactly the outcome that the refusals were trying to prevent. Now pause here. Because if you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict at a level most people never reach. That means you belong here. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. And before you keep watching, take 3 seconds to share this video, paste it in a group chat, send it to one person who would get something out of it. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the people who need this kind of analysis. Now let's keep going, because the deeper layer of this story is where it gets truly important. The 247th incident did not happen in isolation. That is the part that changes the weight of everything we have just covered. Ukrainian signals intelligence and prisoner testimony have been building a pattern for months now. a pattern in which the specific executions and near executions of Russian soldiers by their own commanders is not a single commander losing control, but a recurring feature of how compliance is being maintained in multiple units across multiple sectors of the front. What makes this pattern especially revealing is the language Russian soldiers themselves use when their communications are intercepted. Across different units in different parts of the front, soldiers independently reach for the same phrase to describe their situation. They call it being caught between two fires: Ukrainian fire in front of them, command fire behind them. When soldiers from separate units, in separate sectors, who have not coordinated with each other, independently develop the same metaphor for what they are experiencing, that is not coincidence. That is institutional reality expressing itself through language. Those soldiers are describing the same lived experience of an institution that has become a threat to the people inside it. The phrase itself is a measurement. It measures the distance the Russian military has traveled from the institution it was supposed to be. A military in which soldiers describe the command structure as one of two fires they are trapped between is not a military experiencing discipline problems. It is a military in which the internal contract between the institution and its soldiers has fractured at a level that cannot be repaired by executing more soldiers who refuse orders. That contract, the unspoken agreement between a military and the people who serve in it, rests on a set of foundational commitments. The institution will not ask you to die for an objective it knows is unachievable. The institution will provide the resources it promises. The institution values your survival as an operational asset and not as something to be burned through for political optics. The institution will tell you something approximating the truth about what you are walking into. In the Russian military as it currently operates in this conflict, soldiers have experienced the failure of those commitments repeatedly, promised fire support that never arrived, promised relief rotations that were canceled, promised short campaigns that stretched into years. Each broken commitment on its own might be absorbed. Accumulated over 2+ years of continuous combat, they have produced something that cannot be absorbed. A pervasive, soldier-level conclusion that the institution cannot be trusted. Once soldiers reach that conclusion in sufficient numbers, the institutional tools that normally maintain combat effectiveness stop working. Unit cohesion weakens because soldiers lose confidence not only in the institution, but in each other. If the man next to you is also running a survival calculation rather than a mission calculation, your ability to count on him in a crisis diminishes. Tactical flexibility collapses because adapting to an unexpected situation requires initiative, and soldiers who are running purely on coercion do not exercise initiative. They wait for orders, even when orders are not coming. The willingness to accept necessary risk disappears because the risk calculation has been completely distorted by the gun behind them. The commander who ordered the execution of 3 of his own soldiers was not a monster operating outside the logic of his institution. He was a product of it. He had reached the same endpoint that the institution's internal logic was pushing him toward. The conclusion that coercion was the only tool he had left. The institutional tools, loyalty, mission commitment, unit cohesion, the belief that the sacrifice being asked for served an achievable purpose, had already been depleted. What remained was the threat of death. But coercion only maintains compliance as long as the immediate threat behind the soldier exceeds the threat in front of him. That is a precarious equilibrium. The math is always moving. Ukrainian defensive capability is not static. Russian casualties accumulate. The certainty of death at the front and the certainty of execution from behind become an increasingly fine comparison for soldiers to make. And when a soldier runs that comparison and concludes that the Ukrainian lines in front of him represent something better than what is behind him, coercion does not stop him. He does not become a hero of resistance in that moment. He becomes a prisoner. His hands go up. He walks forward, but not the way his commander intended. This is the end point that the execution of those 3 soldiers was meant to prevent. And because coercion cannot solve a problem created by the failure of everything, coercion is supposed to supplement. Because shooting soldiers who refuse does not restore their belief that the mission is achievable, or that the institution values their lives, or that the fire support will actually arrive this time, the institution watches its soldiers walk toward Ukrainian lines anyway, just one at a time, or in small groups, rather than all at once. The story of those 3 soldiers is not really about 3 soldiers. It is about what happens when an institution exhausts the mechanisms that make people willing to fight for it and reaches for the only instrument it has left: force, raw, naked coercion. The threat behind the soldier calibrated against the threat in front of him. Military history is full of institutions that reached this point. Some recovered when conditions changed enough to allow the internal contract to be renegotiated. Most did not, because the conditions that broke the contract did not change, and coercion, however ruthlessly applied, could not substitute for the thing it was replacing. The 247th Guards Air Assault Regiment was built on the idea that its soldiers were the ones who went where others could not. The 3 soldiers who refused a third assault on a position that had already destroyed 2 previous assault attempts did not break that tradition. They applied exactly the kind of clear-eyed assessment that elite soldiers are supposed to apply. They looked at the situation, calculated the realistic odds, and reached the conclusion that any serious military analyst looking at the same facts would reach. This operation, under these conditions, without the promised support, will fail. Their commander responded by executing them. The operation failed anyway, and the soldiers who were coerced into advancing after watching 3 of their comrades get shot did not fight like elite soldiers. They fought like men who had no other choice, because that is what they were. Here is the question that this leaves us with, and it is a real one. An institution that has arrived at this point, where execution is the primary mechanism of battlefield compliance, where soldiers describe themselves as caught between 2 fires, where elite units are producing refusals at positions that have already been assaulted multiple times with catastrophic losses. That institution is not simply facing a discipline problem, it is facing a legitimacy crisis. And legitimacy crises in military institutions do not respond to more coercion. They require time, genuine success, adequate resources, and the slow restoration of trust between soldiers and the institution that broke it. None of those conditions currently exist in the sectors we are talking about. The ammunition shortages that denied the promised fire support on the day of the 3rd assault have not been resolved. The casualty rates that pushed those 3 soldiers to refuse have not declined. The broken promises that accumulated into a crisis of institutional credibility have not been addressed through any mechanism visible from the outside. What is visible instead is the continuation of the same pattern. More orders, more assaults on positions that have already failed to yield, more soldiers running the calculation between the fire in front of them and the fire behind them, and more commanders reaching for the only tool that the institutional failure has left them. The war is not going to resolve itself on a timeline that allows the Russian military to rebuild what it has broken internally. The soldiers who already carry that calculation, caught between 2 fires, will keep carrying it, and the conclusion that some of them reach will keep producing the outcome that executions were supposed to prevent. 3 soldiers refused orders. Their commander shot them. The assault failed anyway. And somewhere along the front right now, another soldier is running the same numbers, looking at the same math, reaching the same conclusion, not because he is a coward, because the institution that sent him there has already given him every reason to. That is where this ends. Not with a resolution, not with a turning point that changes the trajectory of what we have been watching build for months. With a soldier doing math, quietly, in a trench, weighing 2 fires, and if you have stayed with this to the end, you already know which fire is burning hotter. One last thing before you go, and this one matters. This video exists because people like you choose to support independent, serious analysis of what is actually happening in conflicts like this one. If this gave you something, a clearer picture, a deeper understanding, a perspective you did not have before, then do something with that. Leave a comment below with your actual take on what this incident tells us about where the Russian military is heading. Subscribe if you are not already here, because the next analysis builds directly on this one. And share this with someone who thinks they understand this war, because understanding it at the level of maps and headlines is one thing. Understanding it at the level of 3 soldiers in a trench doing math about which fire is more likely to kill them, that is something different. That is the level where the real picture lives.